The chamber was enormous. It had been built that way on purpose. Every wall, every seat, every carved stone pillar was designed to make whoever stood in the center feel small. The Grand Conclave Chamber of the Galactic Council sat inside Nexus Station, a massive structure that floated in the cold dark near Arcturus Prime. It had taken 4,000 years to build, and it had hosted the most important meetings in the history of the known galaxy. Empires had risen and fallen in this room. Species had been welcomed into the galactic order here, and some had been destroyed here too. Today, the chamber was full. Representatives from 47 species filled the curved rows of seats that rose high toward the ceiling. Some of them breathed air. Some breathed gases that humans would find poisonous. Some did not breathe at all. They came in all shapes and sizes, some tall and thin, some wide and low to the ground, some floating in sealed tanks of liquid. But they all shared one thing. They had all come here today to deal with humanity. Ambassador Velknar of the Solvathi hegemony stood at the central speaking platform. He was tall by most standards, nearly 3 meters, with pale gray skin that shimmered faintly under the chamber lights. His people had been part of the council for over 6,000 years. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance alone, but from a deep and long history of being right. He looked out across the chamber and let the silence hold for a moment before he began. "The Galactic Council," he said, his voice carried clearly by the chamber's acoustics, "has spent the last 14 months in careful deliberation. We have reviewed the expansion patterns of the Terran Empire. We have studied their fleet movements. We have counted their colony worlds, their shipyards, their population numbers, and their resource extraction operations. And after all of that careful study, we have reached a conclusion." He paused. The chamber was perfectly quiet. "Humanity is a problem." There was no outcry, no shock. Most of the representatives had already known this was coming. The Terran Empire had been expanding fast, far faster than any species the Council had seen in recorded history. In just 300 years, humans had gone from a single inhabited planet to over 200 colony worlds. They had built fleets that rivaled the great powers. They had signed trade agreements, formed alliances, and quietly inserted themselves into nearly every major commercial lane in the known galaxy. And they had done all of it without ever asking the Council for permission. Velknar continued, "The Council has prepared a formal document outlining our demands. These are not suggestions, they are requirements, backed by the full authority of this body." He gestured to his assistant, who stepped forward and placed a data chip into the central console. The document appeared on every screen in the chamber at once. The demands were 3 in number. First, the Terran 6 fleet was to be disarmed and decommissioned within 90 standard days. The Council had determined that the 6th Fleet represented an aggressive military posture that violated galactic norms. Second, the Terran Empire was to surrender all territorial claims to the Kepler Expanse, a wide stretch of space rich in rare elements, citing an old Council charter about unclaimed regions. Third, and most strikingly, humanity was to accept a population cap across all colony worlds, a ceiling on how many humans could exist beyond the home system. The third demand caused a low murmur to move through the chamber. Even some of the Council's own members seemed uncomfortable with it. But Velknar pressed on. He explained each point in careful legal language. He cited precedent. He named the treaties and charters that justified the demands. He spoke for nearly an hour without pause, and when he was done, he looked out across the room with calm eyes. "The Terran Empire will comply," he said, "or face economic embargo, travel restrictions, and if necessary, military containment. The Council has acted in this way before, when the situation required it. We are prepared to act this way again." No one needed to say the name of the Greth. Everyone knew it. The Greth had been a proud species once, aggressive and quick to expand. They had refused the Council's direction 1,000 years ago. Now they wandered the outer edges of the galaxy in broken ships, a people with no home and no future. The Council had done that to them, and the memory of it still sat heavy in the galaxy's history. The message was clear: comply or be broken. The session was formally closed. Velknar stepped down from the platform and accepted quiet congratulations from several of his colleagues. The Kreth Dominion ambassador clapped him on the back with one of his thick upper arms. The Mon collective speaker gave a slow nod of approval. Even some of the junior species seemed satisfied, relieved that someone had finally said what needed to be said. No one expected trouble. The Terran Empire was young. 300 years was nothing in galactic terms. They had no allies old enough to matter. They had no history of standing against the combined weight of 47 species. They would read the demands, hold some meetings, make some noise, and then they would comply. That was how these things always went. But then the transmission arrived. It came in through the standard diplomatic channel, clean and properly coded. A council communications officer read it first, frowned slightly, and then passed it to Velknar without a word. The ambassador unfolded it and read it slowly. It was short, very short, for something that was supposed to be a response to an hour-long formal ultimatum backed by 47 civilizations. It read, "The Terran Empire acknowledges receipt of the Galactic Council's communication dated this standard day. A response is being prepared and will be delivered in due course. Emperor Regent Cassian Vale III, Terran Imperial Throne, Terra Nova." Velknar read it again. He turned it over in his mind. He looked for the submission in it, the softness, the careful diplomatic language that meant, "We understand and will consider your demands." He did not find any of those things. What he found instead was a tone he had not expected. Like a person who had received a letter they had already been expecting, and were not particularly worried about. He folded the message and slipped it into his coat. Around him, the chamber was emptying. Representatives heading to their private lounges and ship bays, already planning how they would spend the next 90 days while humanity processed its new reality. None of them seemed concerned. Velknar stood still for a moment longer than the others. Something about the message sat wrong with him, though he could not name exactly what it was. It was the tone, the complete and total absence of fear. He had delivered ultimatums before. He had watched species receive them. They always responded with something: anger, or sadness, or desperate arguments, or pleading. They responded with something human. But this message had nothing like that in it at all. It was simply, "We received your words, we are preparing our answer." Velknar told himself it meant nothing. Young species sometimes posture. It was normal. It would pass. He walked out of the chamber into the long corridor beyond, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, and tried to ignore the small cold feeling that had settled somewhere behind his ribs. Terra Nova was nothing like the stations and outposts that dotted the older parts of the galaxy. It was a real world, a planet with blue water and wide green land masses, and cities that had grown up over 3 centuries into something massive and alive. The imperial capital sat near the northern coast of the largest continent, and at its center stood the Senate Hall, a building that had been rebuilt twice and expanded 7 times since the first colonists had arrived on this world with nothing but ships and determination. The emergency session had been called within 6 hours of the Council's transmission arriving. Senators filled the hall in varying states of anger and worry. Some had come in from their home districts by fast shuttle, still wearing travel clothes. Some had clearly not slept. The air in the hall was thick with the kind of tension that builds when people are trying to be calm, but aren't quite succeeding. On the main screen at the front of the chamber, the Council's 3 demands were displayed in plain text for everyone to read. Senator Mira Kalva, from the Outer Reach districts, had read them 4 times already, and was still angry. She was a short woman with sharp eyes, and the kind of voice that carried easily across large rooms. "A population cap," she said to the senator beside her, keeping her voice low, but not low enough. "They want to tell us how many children we're allowed to have. On our own worlds. Senator Drev Tanis, older and more careful, said nothing. He was reading the section about the Kepler expanse. His family had 3 mining operations out there. Had, past tense now, if the council got what it wanted. At the front of the hall, the Emperor Regent had not yet arrived. His seat at the head of the chamber sat empty, which made some senators more nervous than others. Cassian Vale III was known for being deliberate. He did not rush. He did not panic. Some people found that reassuring. Some people found it deeply unsettling, depending on the situation. He arrived 40 minutes into the session, walking in from the side door without ceremony, and took his seat. He had the kind of face that was easy to underestimate, plain and quiet, with dark eyes that moved carefully across the room. He held a single printed copy of the council's demands in one hand. The margins were already filled with his handwriting. "You've all read it," he said. It was not a question. The hall went quiet. "Good," he said. "Then we can skip the part where we read it out loud, and go straight to the part where we decide what we're going to do about it." Several senators began to speak at once. Cassian raised one hand, and the room went quiet again. That was one of his skills. He didn't need to shout. "I want to hear from Admiral Yoss first," he said. Admiral Yoss was a broad woman with gray hair cut short, and the permanent expression of someone who had spent too many years looking at things she didn't like. She stood and pulled up the fleet charts on the room's main display. The 6th Fleet was shown in its current position, deep inside the Kepler expanse. Several senators looked at it, and looked away. "If we comply with the disarmament," Yoss said, "we lose the 6th Fleet's entire combat strength. That's roughly 30% of our active military capacity in the western sectors. The Kepler expanse would be undefended within a standard month." She paused. "We would also be setting a precedent. The Council would know that the right kind of pressure, applied at the right time, works on us. And if we don't comply," someone called from the back, "then we find out what they're actually willing to do," Yoss said. She didn't sound afraid. She sounded like she was reading a weather report. The debate that followed lasted 3 hours. It was loud at times and quiet at others, and occasionally it stopped making sense entirely. Some senators wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to send a protest and buy time. One senator from the inner worlds suggested they simply comply with the first 2 demands as a show of good faith and argue about the third. That suggestion was met with a silence so cold it effectively ended itself. Through all of it, Cassian sat and listened. He asked questions sometimes, quiet ones, the kind designed to make people say more than they planned to. He did not offer his own view, not yet. Near the end of the 3rd hour, he asked for someone else. "I want Dr. Marlowe brought in," he said. Dr. Yeva Marlowe was the Empire's senior historian and one of the most respected scholars alive. She arrived looking slightly rumpled, as historians often do when summoned to emergency government sessions, carrying a bag of documents and wearing an expression that suggested she had already guessed why she was being called. Cassian gave her the floor without preamble. "Tell them what you told me last year," he said. "The pattern." She set her bag down and looked out at the Senate. "I've spent 40 years studying the rise and fall of interstellar civilizations," she said. Her voice was calm and clear, the voice of someone used to lecture halls. "Specifically, I've studied the moments when one powerful group demands unilateral disarmament from another, citing law, order, precedent, or some version of the common good." She let that sit. "In every single case," she continued, "every single one in recorded galactic history, unilateral disarmament did not lead to peace. It led to absorption, subjugation, or destruction. Not always immediately. Sometimes it took decades. But it always came." She reached into her bag and placed a thick stack of documents on the table beside her. "These are the case studies. I have 31 of them. You're welcome to read them all. The conclusion is the same in every one." The hall was very quiet. "The Kepler expanse," she said, "holds an estimated 40-year supply of stellarite ore. That ore is currently the most efficient fuel source known for high-speed military drives. The Council's most powerful members have been trying to build a new generation of warships for the last 20 years. They've been stalled because they don't have enough stellarite. She looked around the room. They don't actually care about our fleet posture. They don't care about our population numbers. They want the expanse. The rest of the demands are there to weaken us before they take it. Senator Colva said quietly, "How sure are you?" "Completely," Dr. Marlowe said. After she left, the hall was different. Quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full. Full of people thinking hard and arriving somewhere they hadn't expected to be. Cassian stood. He walked to the window at the back of the chamber, the wide one that looked out over the city. It was evening now. The lights of 10 million people stretched out below him, and beyond that the lights of more, and beyond that the glow of the shipyards on the coast, where the great hulls were always being built. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just plainly and to no one in particular, "They've mistaken our patience for weakness. It's time they learned the difference." He turned back to the room. "I want a full inventory of the unregistered reserve fleets," he said to Admiral Yoss. "Everything we haven't made public. Everything we've been building quietly for the last 20 years. I want to know what we actually have." Yoss nodded once. She had been waiting for this. "I'll have the numbers for you by morning," she said. "And I want High Chancellor Danthos contacted," he added. "Tell her to begin preparing a formal response document. Not a reply. A response. There's a difference." He picked up the printed council demands from the table. "They spent years building this case against us. We are going to take it apart piece by piece." He walked out of the hall. Behind him, the Senate sat in silence for a moment. Then it began to move. Slowly at first, and then faster. Like a machine finally being switched on after a long sleep. Outside, under the darkening sky of Terra Nova, the city hummed with its usual life. People ate dinner, and put children to bed, and argued about ordinary things. They did not know yet what their Emperor-Regent had decided. They did not know that something had shifted tonight in a room above their city. But the shift had happened, and what came next would change everything. The Council gave humanity 90 days to comply. By day 3, the Terran Sixth Fleet had not moved. This was expected. Most new powers posture for a while before they accept the inevitable. Velknar and his advisors had built that into their timeline. They had anticipated noise, delay, perhaps a public statement full of strong words that ultimately meant nothing. What they had not built into their timeline was what the Sixth Fleet did instead of moving. It grew. On day 5, long-range Council sensor arrays picked up drive signatures entering the Kepler expanse from the direction of Terran space. 3 large formations, moving at a calm and unhurried speed, not the rushed pace of reinforcements being scrambled in a crisis, but the slow, deliberate movement of ships that had somewhere specific to be and plenty of time to get there. The Terran Third Fleet, the Eighth Fleet, and a third group of vessels that did not match any registry the Council's intelligence office had on record. These ships were black-hulled and carried no identifying markings. They were large. Some of them were very large. The sensor operators who first picked them up spent 2 full hours double-checking their readings before they sent the report up the chain, because the numbers seemed wrong. Ships that size were not built in secret. Ships that size took decades and enormous resources and shipyards the size of small moons. Except apparently, they were built in secret. And they had been. The Council's intelligence chief, a Finn Salvathi woman named Vel Soren, stood in front of her leadership team and said in a carefully controlled voice, "Humanity has been building for a long time, and we did not know about it." No one in the room said anything. "They did not hide it badly," she continued. "They hid it brilliantly. Small construction runs at dozens of sites spread across their territory. Materials ordered in ways that look like civilian industry. Workers who signed agreements we can only guess at. The kind of program that requires patience and coordination across decades. She paused. These are not ships built for war. Not yet. But they are ships that could be used for war. And their existence tells us something important. What does it tell us? Someone asked. That they have been preparing for exactly this kind of pressure, she said. Not reacting to our ultimatum. They were ready before we issued it. This was the thing that kept Vel Saran awake that night, and several nights after. Not the ships themselves, though the ships were troubling enough. It was the timeline. Humanity was 300 years old as an interstellar civilization. The Council had assumed that was young, inexperienced, short-sighted, the kind of species still figuring out how the galaxy worked. But 300 years of quiet, careful building told a different story. It told the story of a species that had been watching the galaxy for a long time, learning how it worked, learning who held power and how they held it, and preparing, slowly and without ever showing their hand, for the moment when that power would be turned against them. On day 12, the Terran diplomatic envoy arrived at Nexus Station. High Chancellor Sarah Danthos stepped off her ship into the docking bay with 2 aides and a small security detail. And she was not what Velknar had expected. He had expected a negotiator, someone who would come in looking for a deal, looking for a way to save face for humanity while quietly giving up most of what the Council demanded. That was how these things usually worked. Danthos was 47 years old, with brown skin and dark hair pulled back from a face that was angular and precise. She wore a simple uniform, no medals, no decorations, nothing that announced itself. She walked like someone who had already decided where she was going, and was simply crossing the distance between her and it. She greeted Velknar politely. She accepted tea. She made brief and pleasant small talk about the station's architecture. And then she placed on the table between them a document that was 712 pages long. The formal response of the Terran Empire to the Galactic Council's communication, she said, in the same pleasant tone she had used to compliment the architecture. Velknar looked at the document. This is your response? It is, she said. It is organized into 4 sections. The first is a legal analysis of the Council's cited justifications for each demand, with citations to the original treaties and charters, including several clauses that the Council's document appears to have omitted. The second is a historical survey of previous cases where similar demands were made, and what happened afterward. The third is an economic assessment of the Kepler expanse and its strategic value, which we felt was relevant context. She folded her hands on the table. The 4th section outlines what the Terran Empire is prepared to do if the Council chooses to pursue enforcement of these demands. Velknar reached for the document. He flipped past the first section, which was dense with legal text and reference codes, past the second, which seemed to be organized by case study, past the third, which was full of resource charts and projections. He found section 4. It was 11 pages long, concise by comparison to the rest. He began to read. Outside, through the observation ports of the station, space was quiet and black. The stars did not care about the document on the table. The stars had watched species rise and fall for billions of years, and had not changed their expression once. But inside the small meeting room, something was shifting. Velknar read to the end of the 3rd page, and stopped. He went back to the beginning of the page, and read it again. His aide, sitting to his left, had also gone very still. Danthos sipped her tea. The document did not make threats in the way Velknar expected. It did not say, if you do this, we will do that. It was not written in the language of anger or defiance. It was written in the language of